All right, I'll take that as a no.
Well, you've also asked everybody to mute themselves, so you might want to ask them to unmute if you want questions answered.
I said people could unmute themselves
Okay.
when they want to speak. Does everyone know? Because you can't tell me, but I assume everyone knows you click that little microphone with the cross through it to unmute yourself and speak.
There's nothing that everyone knows.
You'd be surprised. Some people have been doing this now for 3 months.
Right. But you did say everyone.
Well, it's true. All right. Well, then we're going to move to the formal presentation. So bear with me for a minute.
Ooh.
Does everyone see that?
Yes.
All right. Is it basically full screen?
No.
3/4 screen?
Yes.
When you hit play, it will go full screen.
Yes, you know what? I couldn't see play. I can't see.
It's right there.
No.
It's right.
You're almost on it.
There you go.
Okay, there we go. Okay, so this is Sustainable Backyard. This is part of, I didn't even introduce myself formally. I know a lot of people know who I am. So I am Lawrence Davis-Hollander, and I am work at the library, and I'm also the program coordinator. And I have another life with plants, which I've spent most of my life doing. And I could go through my whole resume, but I've run a nonprofit for seed conservation, particularly vegetable crops, and wrote a book focused on cooking and heirloom tomatoes. And at present, garden constantly, mostly for clients and for myself, and a whole bunch of other stuff. So we've done this part of what kind of garden do you have and what are you doing. Now, some of you may not have something quite as elaborate as these, but they are kind of fun. And one is Monticello, Jefferson's, and the other really formal one is the potager, if you can call it that, at Villandre in France. And let me just check the waiting room. I think there's a few more people, but can't seem to get to them. Oop, well, there's the next slide.
You have to get out of sharing your screen and to admit people.
Oh, really?
I think so.
Well, actually, you know what? I can't do anything now.
Well, if you click escape, you should be able to get out of your presentation. Now you should be able to admit people into the.
Okay, so hang on while I admit a few more people. So that is not very. That's not a very good thing with Zoom. Okay, back to play. Sorry for the interruption. Let me just make sure. Okay, yes. So basically, I just want to talk a little bit about gardens and creating gardens. And essentially the basis of any garden is the soil. And I'm not going to go into a long thing on this, but just to give you an idea, this is an issue. Because I can't admit people and talk at the same time. Hang on, another person to admit. Okay, so this is just to give you an idea. This is basically supposed to be like a gallon of soil, and there's just thousands, and in some cases, billions of species like bacteria, fungi. The higher up on the biological ladder we go, like insects, arachnids, mollusks, you might have some hundreds of species in a small section of soil. Just a few mammals, like moles or voles. But the soil is like an ocean of life. And there's just millions and billions of all kinds of different species in there, all working together, all producing different things and so forth, creating nutrients. We're not going to get into the whole cycle about that, but I just want to tell you how key, how important soil is. And this is soil, in this case, in a field, but it's the same thing in your garden, whether it's a raised bed or whether it's just, you know, something right in the ground or a barrel, which is not quite as living. But if you incorporate enough of the right ingredients, you basically create a living soil, not something that's just dead potting soil. So, you know, the basis, well, a basis of improving the soil is humus, compost. If you don't make your own compost or don't make enough, one way or another, it's worth accessing. And it's kind of hard to use too much compost in a garden. That includes, you know, if you're growing in a bag, a raised bed, a barrel, whatever, lots of compost. And it's almost impossible to add too much compost. We tend to err the other way. So the soil, you know, it is the foundation, just like the foundation of a house. All right, we're going to have to escape for a moment again and meet somebody. So I wanted to talk about a few gardening pitfalls. And there's lots of them, but just a few key ones that a lot of people tend to make a mistake about or don't manage well. And in some of these cases, there's nothing you can do about it now, but it's good information. And in some cases, there are definitely things you can do about it now. All right, we will have to pause again and hang on and admit a couple more people. So here are some of the gardening pitfalls or things to pay attention to. So I've talked about soil quality a little bit. The kind of rule of thumb is to add 1 inch of compost per year. I would say that might be okay if you previously added 3 or 4 or 5 inches of compost. As I said, plenty of compost, humus of any sort, leaf mold is really critical for lots and lots of reasons. Fertilization or just general fertility. One simple way of understanding this, learning how fertile your soil is doing a soil test. Cooperative Extension, I think, does fairly inexpensive soil tests. But if you've added good ingredients all along, again, plenty of compost and so forth, using, I use a lot of organic granular fertilizer, not because I believe it's the best thing, but because it's sort of like taking vitamins. It's sort of insurance and covers your bases. So there are a number of various kinds of organic fertilizers out there, from granular to liquid. And I'm not going to get into a whole discussion now, but if people have questions, we can certainly talk about that. Exposure. You know, what is the exposure of your garden? Very sunny garden is great, but sometimes it may just be baking out there. Or is it, you know, exposed, open, sunny with lots of wind, may make your garden very prone to drying out, especially if it's a raised bed. Obviously, a garden wants to have light. Anything less than 6 to 8 hours is probably not going to be growing vegetables very well, though some things will take a little bit less. But you want a lot of sunlight. Doesn't have to be in brilliant sunlight. All right, hang on again. We got someone else to admit. He can't join this time. Okay. So this is something I see very commonly. My clients do it all the time, is planting too close. Most of us are probably growing fairly small beds or barrels or what have you. And of course, you want to have as much variety and as many of everything as possible, but usually this is a mistake.
That's for this, that's for me.
Now,
The mute is to this side. So I
well,
should
there's a big difference between leaf and fruit. And what I mean by that is, if you have a fruiting plant and you put 3 tomatoes too close together, it really does not benefit the plant or you in the long run. Leafy plants, you can get away with a little bit more because you're not going full season. So if your lettuces are planted a little close together or your arugula is planted a little close together, you can harvest it
they don't
before
have
it's
the
mature.
noise.
I'll remind people to please mute themselves. And it's sort of almost opposite of planting too close. Well, not really opposite, but from seeding, when you're putting in seed, is the failure to actually thin the seeds. And again, just like planting too close, if plants are too dense, they will tend to not perform as well. They'll tend to bolt much quicker, go to seed much quicker, try to compete with each other. It can actually decrease pollination, too much proximity. They can shade each other out. It can create rot. So one of the things in the garden is, you want enough room for all the plants. You want good air circulation. Air circulation reduces the possibility of getting plant diseases and molding and so forth. Watering. Now, at this season right now, I'm going to say we're about a week, with the current temperatures, we're about a week away from what I term drought. I don't know what the weather service is saying. What I see most people doing is radically inadequate watering. It's hard in these kind of temperatures to water too much. And it is certainly possible to water too much, but that's going to tend to be in a rainier situation. Now, a lot depends on your soil. If you've got a heavy clay soil, it's much easier to water too much. If you've got an actual raised bed that's filled with fairly light, friable material, compost, you can probably never water, well, you can water too much, but it takes a lot more work. So something else for the summer garden is that you've filled everything up in your beds and you've got no place to plant anything else. So you've basically haven't planned for the future, planned for growing other things. And you want to stagger some things. You can't plant lettuce in April and expect to have it in July. So succession planning and the ability to plant is important. Another thing, again, it's probably obvious for most of us around here, but the garden has no protection. Simply, for the most part, it's got no fence around it. And depending on what you're growing, you may get away with that. But as most of us know, we've got all kinds of critters, deer, woodchucks, raccoons, on and on. And without at least some kind of minimal fence, your garden is really subject to predation. Another problem or pitfall can be using the wrong crops or the wrong varieties. So just for instance, a lot of people love the idea of growing something like Hopi blue corn, which now actually probably matures here because of climate change, but it's probably not the ideal variety for the Northeast. And we could go on and on, but it's important to choose varieties that work. And you can't always trust the seed rack, or you're planting something that just will never make it at the point where you're planting. So it's good to be aware of what grows, what varieties grow, when you have to plant them, and so forth. And we'll talk a little more about that. Any questions so far? Good. Now, so here's just a few little examples. This is actually a client's garden. I don't think he's actually here. But you can see it's a nice raised bed, this sort of typical about 4 feet, 3.5 feet by 8. But the upper half actually has 2 tomatillas, a pepper, 4 tomatoes. Looks fine now, but in 6 weeks from now, it's going to be a complete jungle. The lettuce looks pretty good, and if they get too big, you can always start harvesting at that point. What you don't see is there's also a row of beans in front of the lettuce. So it's pushing the envelope. You can see that in this next garden where there's all these lettuces. Now, again, if you're growing them for short season lettuces, basically mesclun, and you're going to harvest them very soon, it's fine. But if you're planning to grow them into full heads, they're radically too close. Now, and here's another example. So this could be underwatering, although squash does wilt to a certain degree in the middle of a very hot day. And I'm just using this as one example. So as a gardener, you have to ask yourself, well, is this really underwatered? Is it sort of wilting because it's really hot outside? Or does it have bacterial wilt? So they all look alike. And to some degree, the only way to tell them apart is experience, or give it a lot of water and see if the leaves change. So I'm just giving these as examples. There's dozens and dozens and dozens of things like this that we could talk about. But so, it's important to pay attention to what's going on in your garden. I would suggest daily, or certainly every other day. But in any case, the more observant and the more you observe, the greater your ability to take care of the garden, to basically intervene. So we've got another person waiting for admittance, so hang on. So, here's my basic suggestions for moving forward. Be an observer. And what's the weather up to? Is it not going to rain for the next 6 days? Maybe I really need to start watering. Do plants have holes? Are they wilted? Are they dead? Have they been gnawed? Are there holes appearing where they weren't the day before? Has the plant disappeared entirely, or do they just seem completely happy? And you can see a few of a few of the things you might want to be looking for. And this is, again, just an example. Lovely little potato beetles, mostly on potatoes, but eat other things like eggplants and tomatoes. Or our little friendly voles. You see out of the corner of your eye that little sweet scurrying mammal. It's probably not something you want to be encouraging in your garden. You white moths fluttering around your cabbage and producing these little caterpillars. Again, something maybe you want to pay attention to and do something about. So that's also the ability to understand what some of the kinds of controls, insecticides, herbicides, no.
For some reason, it's a lost
What you
cause.
need to do to control some of these
I
issues,
couldn't hear you.
or be able to go
I'm
to
afraid it's a
sources
lost cause.
to take care of them. So again, particularly for right now, this year, water, water, water. That may change in 2 weeks, but right now, you need to water. And weed, weed, weed. You want to be ahead of the weeds. When people tell me, gee, I can't find my carrots because they're buried in weeds, you probably weren't weeding. Alternatively, to some degree, use of various mulches can cut down a lot on your weeding. Too much mulch is a great place for voles to hide, great place for slugs to hide, can increase rot and wetness if it happens to be a wet year. So it's got its pluses and minuses. On the other hand, at the same time, Mulch helps keep in moisture, reduces watering, and so forth. So, and a lot of things in gardening have a front and a back. So as plants are growing, remember to thin them. Sometimes you can just cut a leaf or two back from a bigger plant that's crowding another plant. With something like squash, of course, they ramble all over the place. So if you're very delicate, you may be able to redirect the vine a little bit. If the vine's been growing in the same place for 3 weeks and is loaded with squash, it's not going to go well if you try to move it. Fertilization, again, good fertility is the garden base, but it's certainly, many plants benefit, especially long season fruiting plants do benefit from side dressing or application of some kind of foliar spray. And then while it sounds fairly obvious, pick when ready, because if you don't pick when ready, it's already gone by. You've lost that peak of quality. And I have a client that says, wow, those radishes were really hot. And it's like, well, that's because they were about to bolt to seed. You were like a week too late. So again, that comes with a little bit with paying attention to what's out there and when things are ready and knowing what that means. So moving forward for the summer. So is it too late to plant now? No, yes, and no. So we have three main categories that answers this question. Yes, yes and no, and no. Well, let's unpack that a little bit. So we're still at this edge of the time in the season where you can still, if you can find any seedlings for sale, you can still put in plants. It's getting close to the time for some things where it's getting too late, but it's still not too late. So much depends on how much water we're getting, how hot it is, and so forth. The current trajectory, I'd say you could still plant some of the items here for another, well, let's start with things like the solanaceous group, tomatoes, eggplants, peppers. They could definitely still go in. Squash still has a little bit of time. Certainly summer squash could still go in as plants. And actually summer squash could still go in as seeds. Things like melon certainly can't go in from seed, but they could still go in from plants. And some of these plants benefit from, though I'm not a big fan, but certainly getting things to ripen like melons do wonderfully on plastic, black plastic typically. Plants of things like cabbage and kale, perfectly fine to put them in now. Things like Chinese cabbage, mustard, and all that, which to me are a little odd to be selling as plants anyway. Sometimes you see arugula for sale in full bloom. They're probably too late. Lettuce, you can still put in lettuce, but it's going to be more prone to bolting, but well worth a try. And I guess a couple of people have been booted out or what have you, lost connection. So I'm going to pause again and let them in again. So some things can still go in from seed and some things can't go in from seed. And there's different reasons why some can and can't. But you can see this list. Mostly these are long season plants, and they really can't go in from seed at this point. Something might make it, but unlikely. And I'll explain a little bit more about things like peas and Chinese cabbage, because some of you may be wondering, because, well, they're not long season. So obviously there are some things that you just can't put in now from seed. And then there's the ones you can put in, but maybe not such a good idea right now. But it depends on what you're going to do with them and when you're going to harvest them. So just for instance, arugula you can sow all summer, but pretty much as soon as it gets a little bit leafy, it starts bolting to seed. If you're essentially harvesting arugula, lettuce, mustard as mesclun greens, as immature leafy plants, you can certainly keep sowing them throughout the summer. All these type of things, of course, again, everything, as I've been stressing, do benefit from lots of water. So plants that will bolt to seed more quickly in hot weather, arugula, Chinese cabbage, so forth, if they're kept nice and moist, or you happen to have a slightly cooler location, or they are mulched, will take a little bit longer to bolt. Peas just don't like hot weather, although if you're growing them in your garden as sprouts, you could be eating pea sprouts. Carrots are short enough day, they can certainly be planted throughout the summer, well, through July. The issue with carrots is unless you're religiously watering them, the seed tends to dry out. So it's a great time to be planting carrots through the end of, almost the end of July, but you've got to water them religiously. A couple of days without water, and people say they never germinated, but they did, and then they died. Now, here are things that'll do, well, again, there's some crossover here, but certainly beans from seed, cucumbers, pretty much you can get cucumbers in less than 2 months, so sufficient time, plenty of time to plant them. Things like kale and collards will certainly do well from seed now. It's getting late for corn, but not too late, especially if you're using a mid-season as opposed to a late season variety. Chard, beets, certainly. Again, the lettuce, arugula, you can keep sowing it, but until it gets cooler again, you probably want to harvest it immature. Sort of the same, well, not quite the same thing with radishes. Radishes can be sown throughout the summer, but they really don't like the heat. So if you religiously water them, you may or may not get radishes, or you may have to take a pause for July and August. So here's ones you can also sow, but maybe not right now, but a little bit later. Again, arugula has been on every screen. So again, it just needs to be managed. Hang on a second, we admit this person one more time. So broccoli, if you had put broccoli in earlier as seed or plants, fine. At this point, it's too late temporarily, but a little bit later in summer. So a lot of the things on this list want to grow and particularly mature when it's cooler out. It depends on how long it takes for them to mature. So you've got to get the timing right. So, if you planted broccoli now, probably not going to get much out of it. Maybe beginning of August, middle of July, but it just depends on what type of plant. So with broccoli, that's under 2 months. You probably want to wait till beginning of August. Similar for cauliflower. Probably true for Chinese cabbage. Garlic is its own category, but we typically plant garlic in the fall, like other bulbs. It likes that nice cool weather to develop a good root system. Although garlic planted very early spring, which obviously we're too late for now, works great too. Turnips and rutabaga. A lot of people say, gee, I can't grow turnips. And that's because they're growing them in the summer. Early spring, particularly for turnips, works great. Or probably towards middle of August, beginning of August. Rutabaga, similar to turnips, but takes like another 30 days. So you can't wait as long to sow rutabaga. So rutabaga is probably around middle of July. Again, lettuce we've gone over, like arugula, does prefer the cooler weather, but if you're growing it for mesclun, immature greens, it's fine. If you want to try to get some head lettuce again, you're probably going to be looking more at, beginning of August. Same kind of idea with the mustards, great for greens, radish. Spinach is sort of its own category, hates heat. So we'll bolt, there's a lot of spinach is already doing now. And so you can take a chance on sowing it probably the beginning of August, if you can keep the seeds moist enough. Ideally, probably later August. And you'll probably get a very scant harvest, unless you've got it in something, in a cold frame or greenhouse or something. But if you're growing the right spinach varieties, the winter hardy spinach, most of them in good conditions will overwinter. And then you're getting spinach first thing in the spring, way before anyone else. So all these things have the particular strategies around them. But summer, there's plenty you can grow in summer. You've just got to get the timing right. And so you should really enjoy your garden. You should play in the garden. You should have a place to relax in the garden. If you've got a big enough garden, absolutely you should have some chairs or a bench or what have you, and enjoy the beauty and the work you've done. And of course, work in the garden. So that's the basic presentation, and happy to answer questions about anything related to gardening, but particularly vegetable gardening.
I have grown some cucumbers, and the plants seem to be doing well, except the first leaves are bitten and have little holes in them. The
Yep.
newest leaves look great.
That means something's eating them.
Okay.
It's hard to know from that description what, but is it eating them a lot, or are they just a lot of little holes kind of exposing the...
The very first leaves were pretty well done in by whatever was eating it, but subsequent leaves just have one or two holes. So it's almost, what I was hoping is if I ignored it, that it would it would have its fill and go away.
That's usually not what happens. They have their fill, mate, lay some more eggs, produce some more bugs, and they keep going.
Okay.
That sounds, and again, it's hard to know, without seeing it, that sounds like it could be cucumber beetles, which are just come out. If it's not cucumber beetles, it could be a whole host of things. But that is certainly something that does prey on cucumbers. They're pretty small. Usually the plants, well, often the plants outgrow them, but not necessarily. They are annoyed by almost any kind of insecticidal powder. I say any kind of, I mean, there's a variety of organic products, and I definitely recommend organic products, but it seems like dust alone is enough to want them to stay away.
Okay.
But don't dust with something like, baking flour. You could try if you had a little bit of wood ash, but sometimes that can burn plants. So better to get a commercial product. Again, I can't swear that it's cucumber beetles, but that sounds very likely.
Okay, thank you.
Who else?
If I could ask another question, if nobody's coming through yet.
Absolutely.
My daughter-in-law planted these vegetables for me. And I used to have a big garden many, many years ago, but right now I just have a couple of big raised pots.
Mm-hmm.
And
And when you say pots, you literally mean like big flower pots.
yes, but they're oval. They're probably each 3 feet long and at least 12 to 15 inches deep.
Okay.
Things do winter over in them amazingly.
All right, so they're pretty big.
Yeah. And she planted a lot of lettuces and arugula, which I'd never planted before. So I shouldn't wait to pick them till they're heads. I should pick them now and pick from the outside in, so to speak.
I think you can use a few strategies. I mean, you can take some of the leaves off delicately. Depends how thickly she planted them. I mean, if they're fairly well separated, though, you can definitely wait till they get heads. Just be aware, again, with these temperatures, that they could start to bolt. So if you start seeing, the middle of the plant, raising up, you better get it, because once they really bolt, the lettuce becomes, well, not entirely inedible, but you kind of lose the head. It turns into a stalk.
Okay. Do you cut with scissors or do you just snap them with your fingers?
Scissors work great. I mean, if it's like a big head of lettuce, which you probably don't have,
No.
you could probably typically use a knife, but scissors generally work fine. Also, to some degree, while not critical, it does help to know what kind of lettuce. So if it's fairly loose looking, maybe a little frilly, that might be what we call a leaf lettuce, in which case it's more designed to be cutting individual leaves. Where if it's, okay, let's just take the obvious, like a romaine or an iceberg lettuce, clearly that forms like a central, essentially a head.
Well, I know there's romaine, there's arugula, and there's obviously red leaf lettuce.
Yeah, so without seeing it, it's hard to say. But if it's a heading lettuce, ideally you want to let it head. If it's a loose leaf lettuce, you can start taking leaves. If you're not quite sure, or it's in between, and there are some in between, you can remove a few leaves. Of course, you don't want to remove too many leaves, and the head won't grow. So, but the big factor is probably making sure, which is easy enough in pots, is to water it. Now the arugula, is a different story, and that you will see, if you start seeing one plant bolting, getting a couple flowers, you definitely want to be clipping your arugula. Now, if you're on top of it and you cut all the arugula down with a scissor and water it well, you may get enough leaf growth to harvest a little more arugula. Ideally, before it gets to that stage, you want to sow some more arugula seed, because in a few weeks you could have more arugula.
Now, one thing, when I clip her herbs, I think of never taking more than a third of the plant. I don't know if that's just a rule of thumb that somebody told me a while ago. Is it the same way with the lettuces, that there's a limit to how much you take?
That's a much more conditional response than with the herbs. Yeah, I mean, I'd say that's sort of well, of course, and you want it fresh, so you don't want to necessarily harvest it all at once, except something that's all about to bolt to seed. Then you might as well harvest it all at once, because it's better to have it in the refrigerator for 2 weeks than have a stalk you can't eat. So it's hard to say in every situation. So like I'm saying, so let's take the arugula. If you harvest, a quarter or a third of it, that sounds just fine. If you see it starting to go to seed, then you might as well harvest all the arugula, and maybe you'll get a few sprouts that are still good again, a few leaves sprouting. If suddenly you've cut it down and it was bolting, and now, it's back to the 70s, the arugula might last another week longer. So again, that's why, in that slide, I said, knowing the weather is also important for your strategies.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to get too carried away with it either. You can certainly arugula lettuce, you can always resow it, plant some more, so forth.
Wonderful. Thank you.
You're welcome. No other questions? Everyone knows?
Yeah, I have one.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, this year I want to make some of my own tomato cage things with wooden stakes, supports for the tomatoes as they get up higher. So
Right.
how do you recommend we do that? Like how
So-
many stakes per plant, and what do you use like for around? You put fabric, or what do you do?
No, well, there's different things to use. Actually, one of the best things, and Leslie can correct me because I always say it wrong, but is basically a fairly heavy-duty fencing. I'm going to call it hog wire, but I can't quite remember if it's technically hog wire. But it's a pretty strong fencing that you can use in different ways. I mean, it's easier, and of course, a lot of it now depends on how you planted your tomatoes. So you may not have planted them in the ideal way to use this fencing. But no matter what, I'd say you want sturdy. So those typical whatever tomato cages they sell, they're largely a waste of time. Although if you put them up with a tomato stake holding them in the ground, they do offer additional support. But on their own, a tomato will pull them over. They are not strong enough to hold up a tomato plant.
Right.
So there are different methods, and I'd suggest looking a little bit on the internet, but certainly one good sturdy stake, as long as you can get, which is usually a 6-foot stake,
Okay.
anchored well into the ground. And if you take it up every fall, they'll last 2 or 3 years, but they can break. Now, alternatively, if you want a really strong stake, you buy T-posts, which don't quite come, I don't think they come 6 feet. The steel post, not the thin steel post, but the heavy-duty steel posts. Those last almost forever. But in any case, just, whatever you see now in the plant, imagine it, like 500 times bigger and heavier. You get a tomato plant loaded with 30 tomatoes. I mean, I don't know, what is that, like 15 pounds? I mean, it's going to pull it over.
Yep.
So my best advice is strong. And no, you don't need to put cloth or anything else around it. You can use it, sometimes you end up getting, like a second stake if the plant's kind of got extra branches and so forth. The best thing though is that kind of fencing I'm talking about, at least in the future, if you can't do it now. And you can use it as an A-frame, you can kind of use it as a fence and kind of weave the plants through it. I mean, there's a variety of ways of doing it, but that really can support the plants.
Cool.
They sell it at Tractor Supply. Does come in these fairly long panels, and you can have them cut them, figure out what size you need and cut them before you bring them home, because they are like 16 feet. But that's great stuff for anything, any vining crop, tomatoes and cucumbers and so forth. Really strong and really durable. That's my best recommendation. Now, I have heard, I've never done it, people actually take, there's a similar material, construction wire, like what they put cement on top of. Those apparently make pretty good cages, which is not surprising, but I would suspect they're not that fun to deal with. I mean, so you can put a circle around each tomato, but I don't think you need to do that. So either I go with the old staking method, or if you happen to have a line of tomatoes, but again, you've had to have set this up beforehand, is the typical commercial way of doing it, which basically you're running a number of lines with a number of stakes in between and kind of weaving the tomatoes in and out. It's basically called a basket weave system. But again, and that works pretty well too, but you probably had to have been set up for that when you planted the plants.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. And if you can tie the tomatoes with something gentle, in other words, like something like jute twine, or you used to see in old Italian neighborhoods, like torn up, rags or sheets.
Yeah.
But not like something like wire. It's going to cut into the stem.
Yeah. Okay.
Common sense, but you never know.
Lawrence?
Yes.
Okay, I fell in love with a pumpkin plant at Freund's this weekend. And
Plant?
pumpkin, giant pumpkin.
Oh,
We
a
all need-
giant pumpkin.
Yeah, everyone once in their life needs a pumpkin patch. So I brought it and I've planted it. And my question is, and I know you should, if you want a big pumpkin, you should eliminate the the flowers so that you only get one fruit. Is that right?
Yeah. My caveat is I'm not an expert on growing giant pumpkins. B, I would be a little, I'd want to have maybe a slightly smaller pumpkin and have 2 fruits, but it depends on how, ambitious you are. I only say that because, fruits do, it depends again how big at a certain point, maybe you want to eliminate the fruit, but I'd be careful of eliminating the flower because fruits do not get pollinated and rot, or for other reasons, they just rot. So if you've only got one, you've only got one chance.
All my pumpkins are in one barrel. I get it. Okay.
Yeah, I suspect let a couple fruit. Then at that point where they seem, where they've gotten at least a few ounces in size, or like a half a pound, whatever, then maybe you would eliminate it.
Okay. But the other thing is, the blossoms look very similar to squash blossoms.
Well, they are squash blossoms.
Well, that's the question is then, can I cook the pumpkin blossoms? Are they edible?
Absolutely.
Terrific.
And now there's a difference between, just so you know, since you're trying to say fruit, there's a difference between the male flowers, which tend to appear before the female for at least a week or two, which are also perfectly edible, and the female flowers. The male flowers tend to be on a little bit of a longer stem, and usually there's no, beginning of a fruit, or without getting into technical terms.
Perfect. I'll
And
watch.
they're all edible.
Thank you.
You can stuff them with something delightful, and I want to know what that is. More questions? Come on, this is too easy.
Okay, I got another one.
All right, fine.
When you're making compost and adding, I get kitchen scraps, et cetera, but is it okay to add things that are technically not good to eat to compost? Let's, for instance, like rhubarb leaves. Can I add that to compost, or is that a no?
No, you can certainly add that to compost. I mean, if we came up with some extremely poisonous plant, and your compost was made entirely out of it. But basically what happens in the composting process is pretty much everything basically gets changed.
Yep.
I mean, for instance, even using, manure from a chemical, your typical chemical dairy farm, apparently whatever residue is in that manure, when you get it, by the time it's truly compost is undetectable.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Good.
But you do want to make sure the basic principles of making compost. Lots of people only use their garden kitchen scraps and then end up with this massive kind of wet, disgusting stuff that eventually does decompose.
Yeah.
But ideally, you want to be adding a little teeny bit of soil just to get the microbes in there. Some kind of higher nitrogen, typically, doesn't have to be, but typically animal waste. Enough carbon, which is probably you don't have enough from kitchen scraps. I mean, carbon being things like, all the clippings from the garden, or hay, straw, grasses. So that mix, and then even there's different ways of doing it, but typically at the base, although sometimes people put perforated pipe in the middle of a compost, you want to make sure it has enough air.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're literally just using your kitchen scraps, it's probably not sufficient aeration to make it work really well. Doesn't mean over time you won't get compost. It'll all decompose sooner or later.
Yeah.
But if you really want to make a proper compost pile, you do need, well, it's kind of like cooking. I mean, you need a variety of ingredients for it to come out right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else?
If I may ask another one,
Well, yes, go right ahead. No one else is asking.
I discovered Swiss chard this winter, and it's absolutely delightful and delicious. And again, my daughter-in-law planted some of that for me.
Great.
I haven't the slightest idea, and I haven't looked it up yet. I've been busy with the other library Zoom classes. For
You go to another library's classes?
well, yeah, uh, um, you have the one that started as a procrastinator and became the now habit,
Ah,
etc.
good. Okay. Anyway, go on.
So, and I've enjoyed them thoroughly. They're really wonderful. So Swiss chard, do I treat it like the lettuces and so on, or is it a different
A
beast?
Swiss chard is a different animal entirely. So you can harvest it when it's fairly young. In fact, it's even put into mesclun, which I think is kind of silly. But so the stalks don't have to be huge, but I'd say my preference would be to let the Swiss chard get fairly mature, then start cutting the stalks. Then it's also has grown enough that it's going to keep growing faster and faster. But if you cut off those stalks early, even though it's nice to have a treat, the plant will just grow slower and slower. So you really want to wait, or at least from my viewpoint, wait till you've got those nice, like Swiss chard in the store, a little thicker stalks and a nice big leaf, maybe, what a foot high or 15 inches high. I mean, you want to let it get a little size. In any case, what you do want to do is cut the oldest stalks first.
Okay.
And scissor usually works fairly well for that. You can cut it all down and let it re-sprout, but that's a little mean. And again, will slow your production. So that one, yes, much more, that one's perfectly suited to sort of selectively harvesting the biggest leaves first.
It's really delicious.
It is. So you've been steaming it?
Yes.
Great.
And I love spinach, but it doesn't have the bitterness of spinach.
You think spinach is bitter? That's interesting. Okay, well,
I love spinach, but there is a slight bitterness to it in comparison to the chard.
interesting. Well, some of that may be how it's grown, but I never thought of it that way. But everyone's got their own taste.
Thank you.
Leslie's nodding her head like, yes, it's bitter. And well, yes, because I told you spinach is bolting to seed. But anyway.
Well, I grew up with Popeye, so.
Most of us probably did. Other questions? Going once, going twice? All right, well, sounds like everyone's happy with whatever they've gotten. If you do have other questions, you can always contact me. I was going to say feel free to talk to me at the library, but that's really not possible at the moment. Unless you call. I'll be there on Saturday, 1 to 5. Generally trying to get people books, but we can talk about vegetables too. Oh, and by the way, upcoming in the Sustainable Backyard series will be pickling. I don't quite remember the date. It's around June 10th, if that's a Thursday. And then the next week, I believe June 17th, will be a class on basic Ayurveda and immune support, particularly in light of COVID. So that should be pretty interesting and relevant. So those are coming up in July.
And they were all Thursdays at 7?
We're trying to keep the adult programs for now Thursdays at 7. I suspect we'll keep doing Zoom into the fall. We'll probably go back to 4 o'clock Saturday classes as we get into September or October. But seeing for summer, we know people want to be outside most of the time. So we arrived at the Thursdays at 7.
Well, it's been wonderful. Thank you.
Well, you're very welcome. You're all very welcome. Last chance for any questions? Okay, well then, thank you all very much. We'll see you sooner or later. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great rest of the evening.